We go ahead and get this show on the road then. This is our Millennia and Microcosm series as a sub-series of the Kenneth Smith series, which is going for years. This is, for those who are just joining us, this is going through the installments of a column called End Times that appeared in the Comics Journal, of all places, in the back of the Comics Journal, around the years 1998, 99, 2000. And it's being collected into a book called Millennia and Microcosm, in which Kenneth Smith sets out to examine three well-documented but really mutually antagonistic worldviews: the modernist worldview, the medieval worldview, and the ancient worldview, in order to get us to understand them not as modernist caricatures, since we're all moderns, but to get us to understand them in their own right, to learn how to pick up each one and use it to look at the world and to look at the others and to look at itself, to liberate us from the trap of being moderns and only having one worldview that we assume is reality itself. This whole book is about the project of learning to lever yourself out of the trap of the worldview that you're born into, so that worldviews can become something that you assume and set aside and not something that traps you. We are in chapter 4, which is where he, in a series of lettered sections, nails each of the core principles of the ancient worldview, taking the example of the ancient Greeks primarily. We are in section B, custom and nature, aristocracy and philosophy, and we are at the end of section B in the final paragraph, which is where we've been for 3 weeks, and we'll probably be here for about that many more before we can finish it off. It's only 2 or 3 sentences, but they are pulling together everything he said so far in the book into one core statement that sets us up for section C. Just like section B built on the concept of nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth, which section A was about, in the same way, section C is going to build on these previous 2 sections. And so we're pausing to make sure that we really understand this. The other reason we're pausing is I'm doing something I'm probably never going to do again, but it needed to be done at least once, which is to try to help people understand that Kenneth Smith doesn't use the language the way he does in order to impress anybody or to obscure it. He's not trying to puff himself up and show you what a big vocabulary he has. Trust me, if he were trying to do that, it would be completely incomprehensible. What he's trying to do is use language in a poetic, philosophical way that is extremely dense with meaning, so that he is alluding to other people's philosophies, whole books of philosophy or whole lifetimes of philosophical work. He's using key phrases in this construction of this sentence in order to capture those meanings and pull them together to weave something that's very rich and dense. And if we do this once and walk through this and you see how it's done, then you'll be able to do it yourself after this. Anytime you feel like it, anytime you're reading Kenneth Smith and you come across a phrase that rocks you back on your heels and you go, wait a minute, you can pause then and do this little exercise of picking it apart, showing how it works, and putting it back together so that you can start to read the sentences the way that he meant them when he was writing them. And as part of this, I'm also trying to demonstrate that this isn't just something I'm claiming he does. We've seen him do this. We've talked to him about this. He's talked to great length about the work that he did to try to reinvent the way that he writes and why he does it. And we went through both of these sentences at the beginning before starting this exercise. And now, as we work our way through, we're beginning to see how much more there is than we thought there was as we dig deeper. And when we get to the end, we'll look again one last time at these 2 sentences and say, do you see how different your understanding is of this short paragraph now that we've gone through this than it was when we first skimmed over it on our way to section C? So what we've done in the past weeks is gone most of the way through the first sentence. In fact, we got all the way through the first sentence. And I thought today could be a palate cleanser, and we could do some observations and quotes that I know Kenneth Smith was thinking of when he wrote this sentence, to sort of, reach out beyond the claustrophobia of being buried in one sentence. And we can start to talk about a bunch of perspectives that are being touched on here. But before we begin, I see that Phil has something to say. So why don't, Phil, would you come off mute and share it with us?
Yeah, I think I have something that might be very pertinent to what we're talking about. Actually moving into the Middle Ages and bridging in the Middle Ages. I was yesterday in a meetup with talking about Hegel's dialectical law. Dialectical logic, which is different from reductive logic. And he sort of at one point said something that I thought was very interesting. He says, the difference between the finite and the infinite is the finite things die. In other words, they end. And so therefore, in a sense, it is not eternal. So therefore, embedded within being finite is change itself. And that is the basis for dialectical thinking, because wrapped into that is that we are beings that exist in life. And in life, we understand change. Change is a necessary part of things. And so that was the basis of that argument. And and he went on a little bit further. And I asked him a very pertinent question. I thought I did, at least. I said, why is it that the Greeks who were almost there could not break through this? And I presented the relationship between Plato's philosophy and Aristotle's philosophy. And they needed to be integrated in some way. And I said, it seems to me with Plato's philosophy, he got part of it right, which is that the divided line, that the desire to go beyond the divided line, which is actually the divided line of the dialectical thinking, is something that's transcendent. I'll not use the word transcendental, transcendent, an aspiration that we reach for. And why was it that Plato never was able to reach into the transcendent through this sort of speculative thinking to reach that? And then I said, well, it seems to me Aristotle went the other way, which is to look at the unfolding of things in nature. And it seems to me somehow because they split, because they had worked together, they would have reached the relationship between the divided line of the transcendent and the manifest. And I said, what is curious in a way is that the medievals did that, but they did it in a different way, slightly different way. They translated Plato's transcendence into the transcendental. So instead of an aspiration of reaching for the infinite to the speculation, it sort of like this transcendental thing which we call God. God knows everything, and it's reaching down into. And in addition, it really created a trinity, which is interesting because the transcendental God, with his knowledge, reaches down into Christ, which is the manifestation on earth. So the earthly thing and the heavenly thing was that, and incorporated with that was the Holy Spirit, which sounds a hell of a lot like Geist. And I say that diagram was there, except it was dialectically structured in the opposite way that Plato and Aristotle would have structured it. And why could they not have worked together in some form? I know they split apart, but in some form, and they could have reached that point of not having to depend on the transcendental, but merely relate the dividing line as the horizon of human existence. which Heidegger talks about. And in the horizon, that is the link between the finite and the infinite. And the speculative is something that reaches into the horizon, through the horizon, in order to create not necessarily the truth, but a desire to reach the truth. And it seems strange because like that is exactly the need, the thing that we needed without having to depend on a God, a transcendental God. And it's like, but they were not there, and they were stopped. And then the Christians actually took it on and created the how say it, the structure. And now we flipped it back the other way. And that's what we're doing. And so it's a mystery because they were so close. They were so close, but they didn't get there. So that's my thought. And I think that really actually is sort of saying how the Greeks were incredibly close to the point that Hegel was talking about.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, that's right. Part of what's intriguing about the classical Greeks is it's not just their strengths, but their weaknesses. How could you walk right up to it and see so much of it and then not see the rest of it? And in this, we have an object lesson. The Greeks were very familiar with their heroes serving as object lessons since they made every kid read, the Iliad and the Odyssey. They had to grow up reading about how the greatest Greeks of all time destroyed the Greek world and ushered in this centuries-long dark age. This notion of strengths and weaknesses being bound together so tightly through the union of human character was thus, a concept they were very familiar with. And although they may have wished above all things never to repeat that tragedy, and yet they did, they would understand the importance of an object lesson to civilization. It was their whole cultural strategy for paideia, was trying to identify who most exemplified the things we need to learn about and to study their lives and what happened. The way that they wove history and biography and ethics and truth together into this particular formulation is such that however uncomfortable it would have made them, they would have entirely accepted the idea that yes, they too were going to end up being somebody's object lesson. How can you do this? How can you look right at it and see so much of it and yet miss so many critical pieces? Well, that's partially what this paragraph we're going through is about. It's talking about not just a human liability or weakness that means that sometimes we are drawn away from the truth, but rather these potent gravity wells that draw us away from the truth through our very seeking of the truth. The very tools we think of as tools but aren't tools at all that we are using to try to understand the world are also helping us, in fact, compelling us to misunderstand the world in distinctive characterological ways. So thanks for bringing that up. So for those just joining us in this paragraph, the final paragraph of section B, there are two sentences, a shorter sentence and a longer sentence. We spent a lot of time on the shorter sentence because it's packed. And that sentence is this: aristocrats are distinguished by an ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth so visceral, it must be elusive to the inventive and narcotized minds of ordinary men. So we've just spent several weeks going through that, picking it apart. And if you haven't been with us for those past weeks, you can find those videos on David Roel's YouTube channel. So look at Millennia and Microcosm for the previous few weeks, and the group will take you on a little tour of the significance of that sentence. We're going to dig into it more when we dive into the second sentence, but this week we're going to pause and take a break right between the two and bring in some other perspectives that Kenneth Smith often brings to bear when he's talking about these core issues. Why do we misunderstand the truth the way that we do? Why is it in our nature to do so? In fact, in our natures, because we have these twin basal metabolic faculties of the mind. We have Gnosis, the experiential, immersive quality of intelligence that allows us to perceive what's happening, that allows us to feel the feelings that we have about it, that allow us to remember the past and to have those feelings. So that whole complex of immersion into the flux of the world, that's one of the core metabolisms of the metabolic functions of the mind. But in its naive form, the form we're born into, the infantile form, it's a trap, and it turns into begriff, using Hegel's terminology, where we cut ourselves off and become parochial, and we start to mistake the power and immediacy of our really parochial individual experience for the whole world. And we think the world is and can be nothing more than what we have experienced. All sorts of things follow from that. There's all kinds of liabilities that go hand in hand with the strengths of Gnosis in this naive form. And the other basal metabolic function, of course, is Noesis, the abstracted, negating, logical, rational, mathematical, systematizing, reasonable side, which begins by pushing off against begriff and developing this capability to extract ourselves from the live wire flux of life an infant finds themselves in order to reflect upon the past and try to predict the future, and thus to try to control our own behavior, to manipulate our world in order to shape the future the way that we want it to be. The development of will and intelligence, in the sense that moderns mean it, go hand in hand in Noesis in a way that moderns don't understand. There is a willfulness to every academic. To every logician, there is an ego that they don't fully appreciate in themselves, but that people like Kierkegaard, Hegel, Nietzsche, and others have diagnosed. And so the strengths and powers, the abstracting, universalizing powers that intellect gives us as we develop it, comes hand in hand with a certain egotism, a willfulness, a pride, a blindness, because we see our intentions more and more clearly, and as a result, we unsee the unintended consequences of our actions and erase them from our picture and say, well, that wasn't my fault. Let me find some angry person I can blame that on because they're too emotional. The noetic, the Verstand mode, which is the naive form of noesis that Hegel diagnoses in us, it becomes a scapegoater that blames emotionalism for all the world's problems and praises and idolizes intellect and intelligence and systematization and order as the source of all goodness. And thus you get holocausts where the Nazis carefully, meticulously plan out doing this terrible thing because they're very efficient at it and because they have disconnected themselves from the moral compass of the emotional experience of life that would make us sympathize with somebody else. So this is all being set up here in this sentence. And it's explored even more deeply in the next sentence. And yet he doesn't use any of the words I just used. But if you've read the previous 3 chapters, and if you've been with us on the discussions before, you can see how Kenneth Smith, these concepts are sitting on Kenneth Smith's shoulder at all times when he's writing and when he's thinking about writing. This is his framework for understanding human character. So if we're talking about an ethos, then we're talking about character. And if we're talking about character, then we're talking about human characterology. And that leads into this notion of the douloi, who are trapped within their begriff mode of understanding, the banausoi, who are trapped within their Verstand mode of understanding, and the aristoi, who struggle to liberate themselves from them by embracing the third adult faculty that we almost never see in the modern world, but that used to be something somewhat more common than it is now. Understanding that changes our interpretation of a sentence like this. We understand an aristocrat cannot be simply whoever's in charge. By definition, by the Aristotelian definition, that would be an oligarch, not an aristocrat. An aristocrat is an aristos. That's what makes them fit to kratain, to rule. So there's all this stuff here. These words that we so quickly read past with modernist definitions have these very deep roots and this interconnectivity to all these other concepts, this whole framework of how to understand human history, how to understand intelligence, the development of the human animal, our evolution, and so forth. And he's written about this. He writes about this basically in every book he does, one way or another. In this book, he's tackling it with this concept of millennial perspectives and worldviews and how do they differ from each other. In other books, like his first two books of parables, Otherwise and Webs, he does it in tiny little bites, often in metaphorical terms, little stories, little definitions, and so forth. And it is, as we will see, those books and those perspectives are very, very close to this paragraph. So I'm going to drop a few quotes out of those books into the chat here for us to talk about, and you'll see point by point how closely related they are to what he's talking about here. The first one is a favorite Nietzsche sentence. We're spending weeks unpacking two sentences, which would seem like a very impractical thing to do, right? Very silly, very not modern. There's no pragmatism here. But there's a reason for that. And the reason is captured in this Nietzsche quote from Twilight of the Idols. It is my ambition to say in 10 sentences what everyone else says in a book, what everyone else does not say in a book, i.e., what even a book doesn't manage to capture in terms of its implications. Nietzsche loved the art of concentration and condensation, that poetic philosophy that says that is more a form of art than a form of engineering, that says so much more than it says, that carries with it an enormous freight of meaning, waiting for the right reader who won't just skim over it, but'll look at the sentence and its structure and go, there has to be more here, because on the surface, I can't figure out what this sentence is trying to say. There must be more going on. And then as you unpack it and find the relationships, the sentence suddenly starts to make more and more sense. I was talking with my wife, Beverly, about these two sentences in this final paragraph and laughing, because you could write an entire book just about these two sentences. If you tried to unpack them and show not the trivial meaning, but all the deep meaning, the really important, juicy stuff that is captured in these two sentences, it would take a book or more than a book. It's like in this, Kenneth is doing what Nietzsche wanted to do. And it's not a coincidence. Nietzsche is on Kenneth's list of existentialist forebears. Kenneth knows Nietzsche up one side and down the other. He's taught endless classes about Nietzsche. He's written about Nietzsche. He's always got Nietzsche in mind. If there is a pithy, short, potent quote from Nietzsche that is related to what Kenneth Smith is writing in his sentences, you can be sure that Kenneth was thinking about that when he wrote those sentences. I can't do that with as many philosophers as Kenneth can. He's been at this a lot longer than I have. But this is how I am with Heraclitus. You'll hear me talk about Heraclitus a lot. And the reason is I know all of Heraclitus's fragments, forwards and backwards, multiple translations. I have a whole 2 bookshelves full of translations of Heraclitus. I write about him a lot. I think about him a lot. And even so, I haven't thought or written about him as much as Kenneth has. And Kenneth has done that for all of these other philosophers too, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Hegel, Hannah Arendt. He brings in Kafka, he brings in Dostoevsky, he brings in Philip Rieff from the 20th century and others. And the point of that is, when he sits down to compose a piece of philosophy like this paragraph, he starts by writing up a list of juicy quotes. I have a couple of those documents lying around for a couple of these books, which are the quotes that he put together before he started writing the book. So I know he does it. So the more you get to know Nietzsche or Hegel or whoever, if you can see the connection, then probably Kenneth saw it before he started writing it. And that's why he wrote it the way he did. And that's why he chooses terms like aristocrat specifically. He could have said an aristoi, are distinguished by an ethos of commitment, but he didn't. He said aristocrat. And he said aristocrat because he means aristoi in the mode that because they are aristoi, they are potentially fit to govern in a way that Douloy and Benausoi are not. That is to say, he's not just bringing in the concept of aristoi, he's bringing in Aristotle's theory of government. The entire book on politics is being inserted into this opening sentence through this word aristocrat. This is how Kenneth thinks and writes. And that term ethos, we went through this before, ethos anthropoi daimon, character is fate, is one of the core statements on human character out of Heraclitus. And Kenneth Smith always has Heraclitus in mind. So if ethos is here, then Heraclitus is being summoned along with Aristotle to do duty for us. The phrase, I'm just doing a quick skim of this for the people who maybe weren't here in the previous weeks, but to kind of show the way in which this illustrates the Nietzsche quote. You can see what he's doing here. He says intrinsic truth, a commitment to intrinsic truth. Why the phrase intrinsic truth? Because section A, the title of section A is nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. He is weaving in the entire first section of this chapter directly into this sentence through this evocation of the phrase intrinsic truth. And intrinsic truth captures the concept kata fuse, according to nature, that it's that how you feel about something is not the ultimate authority on whether something is true or false, that how you reason about something, your logic, is not the ultimate authority. It doesn't matter if it makes sense to you logically or not. The only thing that matters in the ancient Greek perspective, in a way that's really alien to the modern world, is whether nature herself manifests this truth. If it does, then it's true in an authoritative way, even if you have no model to explain it, even if it's an anomaly. Too bad. That's nature speaking with the voice of authority. So this is being invoked here, an ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth. This is pulling in this ancient concept of what is nature like, and where does truth come from? It's all being woven in here. And the same is true with these. If you're not familiar with Kenneth Smith, what must feel like jarringly strange word choices, visceral, elusive, inventive, and narcotized minds, right? All of this has been constructed in order to pull in different philosophers and make a statement in one sentence that, is what everyone says in a book or does not say in a book in the way that Nietzsche is talking about. He's writing this way, not gratuitously to show off, but to try to raise the level of discussion above the ordinary, above the picayune, above the details, above whether you can prove this point or that point. He doesn't care. Vast swaths, vast libraries of what passes for philosophy in the modern world, which is obsessively concerned with not missing a single step in a logical syllogism to prove that their system of logic is correct. He doesn't care about any of that. He's just sweeping all that aside and saying, leave that level for people who are at a sub-philosophical level. At the philosophical level, there are big things you have to grapple with, like what is the nature of intelligence? What is the nature of human beings? How do we see the world? And how does all of this inform the kinds of cultures we create and our ability to see or not see what's true or what's good? He's trying to get at the problem of human existence. And you're never going to get there if you're working one little picayune step at a time through logic, because logic is bound by the rules of noesis, and noesis in this model is a half-witted approach to the world. You need gnosis and noesis bound together. All right, that's Nietzsche. Questions on Nietzsche before I do Kafka? Kafka's next, or does this make sense so far? You see the connection? This is part of why Kenneth writes this way. He's got Nietzsche on his brain. All right, well then, next up, let's do Kafka. This quote appears in a frontispiece to his book Otherwise, and they appear in this order. I'm presenting them in the order that he presents them on the page of quotes, because he's thought this through before. Kafka, a book must be an ice axe to break the frozen sea within us. That is, He's not overly concerned with whether the book pleases us or entertains us or makes us comfortable. He doesn't really care whether we read this book and we come away from it going, wow, that Kenneth Smith sure is a smarty pants. He could care less. He has a specific mission, and his mission is the Kafkaesque mission. He sees our intelligence as trapped within labyrinths that we don't even think are there, that we are unable to move our minds flexibly over the whole scope of the problems that we're trying to solve. Our modernity gives us a worldview that acts like a series of funhouse mirrors and lenses, so that everything we look at is warped and distorted. Many things are hidden from us, and the things that are there are reassembled in a Frankensteinian fashion, so that their meaning is obscured and reassembled not only into a different meaning, but in many cases into the opposite of the truth, specifically in order to protect vested interests, great concentrations of capital and so forth. So we need leverage to get out of that trap, so that we de-ossify our minds. And that's his goal with this. His goal is to go right at the core problem of why we are not seeing the world the way that it is, even though that's an extremely difficult, uncomfortable, hazardous thing to do. And nobody's going to thank us for it. Nobody's going to thank him for it. This is not, Kenneth Smith is definitely of the social gadfly school of philosophy. He wants to say the things that we don't want to hear, but that we need to hear. And specifically the things that are what, as a teenager, he called logic bombs, the things that are most likely to disrupt our comfortable chains of logic and show how there are in fact chains, and we're stuck and we're not seeing things the way they really are. So Kafka, right? And you see the relationship. Oh, go ahead, Stephen. Let's pause here. Come off mute and walk us through it. What do you got?
Terms logic and rationale, when people talk about logic, I get the feeling they're really referring to rationales. Mr. Spock is a famous case. He's always using the word logic, but he's talking about the Vulcanian rationales. Logic seems to be a tool to distinguish between what is perceived to be true and false. It's not perfect. Not necessarily perfect. Rationales is a different thing, and you distinguish between them because logic is a tool or a method. And it's actually rationality, which is a world conception. That is, rationality does actually make a holistic claim about the cosmos, or it gives us a cosmic view. Rationality is claiming that rational rules underlie our outward phenomena. We have two types of outward phenomena. We have the world of physics and the world of metaphysics, the mind. Now, physics, we feel we can measure. We can measure the elements, physics that create a car engine to a very refined degree. But when it comes to the mind, we've got problems. It's not so, we do measure it, but it's not so easy to measure. For example, I could state I was more angry yesterday than I am today. I'm actually measuring anger, but there's no way at the moment science can actually put anger in a test tube and give us a refined readouts of what it is. So that's my question. What's the difference between rationality and logic?
Yeah, good one, Stephen. Thank you. So, in this case, when we talk about Oasis, and it's part of why I like to use the term Oasis as often as possible on this, it is an entire constellation of approaches. It goes beyond any one of these things. And rationality, likewise, can be used sometimes as a synonym for Oasis in some ways, except that rationality comes with such a freight of approval and worship that it's almost impossible to talk about it clearly, because, of course, everyone assumes, because we've been programmed to assume this way, that the rational is better than the irrational. Just like we think that progress is better than not progress and modern is better than not modern. There's this value judgment built in when we use the modernist terms for these things. But let's go ahead and do it anyway in this case, understanding, taking that as a caveat. This idea that it all makes sense, and that we can think our way through to utopia or whatever we're willing to admit as the best possible outcomes. It always does this by wearing the mask of logic and math. It says logic and math are pure and perfect and infallible if you follow their rules. And we do that, says the rational person. And as you point out, there's actually a difference, because nobody, in fact, does that most of the time. We don't logic our way to whether it's time to take a shower most of the time. We don't logic our way to whether it's time to take a drink. Or as you say, we don't logic our way to whether we're angry or not. Or rather, as somebody who went through a hyper-intellectual phase and was a child of a hyper-intellectual father, that's exactly what hyper-intellectuals try to do. They claim that they're living their lives in a strictly logical way. And in fact, it's not possible to do that. But what they do is, anytime they're called on their own irrationality that's built into their rational worldview, they immediately whip out their logic and say, "Nah, look at my logic." And of course, a second before, that thing was in their back pocket and they'd forgotten about it back when they were starting to lose their temper. But now, oh, no, I'm not angry, I'm logical. And one of the clearest signs of the discrepancy is the ultra-intellectual yelling, "I'm not angry," which I've done when I was younger and which my dad did in my youth. And in that, you can see the negation that Hegel talks about. That is a core defining trait of Oasis, that it exists not in its own right, but as a negation of Begriff. They've pushed off against the emotionalism and experientialism, the sensory life, the memory life of Gnosis, into what they believe to be the perfect safety and order of Noesis, but which actually ends up being Verstand. And in doing so, it creates blind spots all over the place, right? And the reason it does that is because our Gnosis is still in us at all times, even in the ultra-intellectual. The Gnosis is still there in full force, trying to sway us with its feelings and its sensations and its memories. And the Banalsos, who has embraced Verstand, or Oasis, is fighting against that at every moment by negating it. By you can't shut off the impulses, but you can censor them and step on them and say, "I'm not angry." And so what happens, borrowing from Freud, is a kind of repression and suppression, side by side, both techniques, in which you can have anger but not know it. You can be hungry and not know it. I talk often with my business partner about how I'll look up and it's 4 p.m. and I haven't eaten all day, but I didn't notice that I was hungry because I was so captured by the noetic side of my mind that I was disconnected from the reality of my body. My body really was hungry, even while that whole time I was telling myself I was not hungry. It's not just a disconnect. There's a schizoid existence in every intellectual. Speaking as somebody who lives that life, there's a schizoid existence in which reality as it actually is and is experienced has been split away from reality as we've defined it, as we've chosen to will it, as our systems of logic permit it to exist as an object within our schema of rationality. So what happens, therefore, is that the dedicated rationalist takes tools like math and logic and brings them out whenever it's convenient and forgets about them, and they slip into the back pocket whenever it's not convenient, while the whole time denying that they're flipping back and forth in this patchwork, mosaic, Frankensteinian way. It's a fascinating thing to study. And we're going to get more into that over the course of this book. it's this is the good stuff you're bringing up, Stephen. This is the rich stuff about human experience. What the Greeks would postulate and what Hegel would postulate, and maybe Kierkegaard and Smith, is that there is a third mode of existence that's possible, in which you're not trapped either within Begriff or within Verstand, but it may not be possible in modernity, because modernism, its core strategy is to create a flatland of human character that prevents the emergence of Aristoi, so that nothing can challenge the great machine and its functioning. So according to our clock, Phil next gets the comment at 12:04. So I'll keep you in the queue for now, Phil. Don't forget what you have in mind, because I know it's going to be good. So we'll go to Donald next. Go ahead, Donald.
This idea of reason gets used two ways. The Greeks were well aware, that you have these appetites, and reason may govern the appetites. And so decide what the appetite may say, I'm hungry. And reason may say, well, I should eat a healthy diet, what I eat instead of whatever. But there's also where the appetites, and this is rife in modernity among rational moderns, is the appetites still drive, and moderns are inventive, this word that Kenneth has used here, and that they know how to use reason instrumentally to achieve an end, not to reason about ends or decide which ends they should be directed towards, but just to have their appetites produce an end unconsciously, and then their reason help them achieve it.
Yes.
Money, women, I don't know, whatever you want. Reason is a tool.
Right.
And I think that's what Kenneth says about the Gnostic side, the noetic side. It's reason being used as a tool, not to discuss first things, not as a, I don't know, kind of fits in with Stephen's metaphysics,
Yes.
that the mind use it to discuss the good. Well, that's enough.
Well, that was good. Thank you. Yeah. And this is what you see is that there are many possible ways in which Verstand could express itself potentially in the range of human possibilities. But under modernity, it is expressed in very specific ways, practical, pragmatic ways directed towards goals, but not directed towards actual true ends or principles. As you say, first things are not allowed to be discussed. They're considered to be ridiculous, impractical pursuits, just like the Romans thought about philosophers. So modernity thinks about philosophers. It's fine if you can figure out a way to make some money from it, or if that's what you need to be happy on the weekends, but leave it at home when you show up for work in the morning. Don't start questioning the nature of the authority of your boss, or you'll be fired. And by fired, we mean, or we will threaten your ability to have a home or health or all the other things that you need. So the threat is severe. The punishment is severe. And that topic is going to come up in the second sentence when we start digging into that next week. That there are enormous penalties in modernity for attempting to attempt to philosophize, to attempt to engage in heuristic behavior. It's not permitted. While we pretend that anything is permitted, in fact, we make the consequences so awful that nobody would want to do it. So I'm going to throw in a few more quotes out there, but again, Phil, hang on to your concept. Don't forget it. We'll be coming back around to you in a little bit. The next quote, which is the next one that appears in line in the opening of Otherwise, is Kierkegaard. And again, this goes to why would Kenneth write in such a difficult way? Why won't he write in a way that pleases people and that most people could understand? Why won't he do that? And so we've approached that a bit with Nietzsche. We've approached it with Kafka. Let's approach it with Kierkegaard. From the Journals, year 1845, he says, this is one of my favorite Kierkegaardian quotes because boy, does it sum up Kierkegaard's entire approach in a nutshell. On every side, one genius after another appears and makes life and existence and the historical means of conveyance and communication with eternal happiness easier and easier. What do you do? Could you not discover some way in which you too could help the age? Then I thought, what if I sat down and made everything difficult? Instead of trying to make everything easier, what if you tried to make them harder? Because after all, there's plenty of people making them easier. You aren't needed for that work. It's already being done. What if instead you were trying to make things harder? And built into this is all sorts of questions. I mean, this Kierkegaardian sentence is very Smithian, if you know what I mean. It is one of those sentences where you read it and you go, what? Why would you do that? I don't understand where he's going with this. And the reason you don't understand where he's going with it, if you're a pop culture reader, is because pop culture has no place for the concept that it could be good to make things harder. We lust for simplicity. We lust for ease. We want the truth handed to us on a platter, pre-chewed and preferably pre-digested and flavored with salt and sugar and so forth. We want pablum. We want a lappy life in which things are just laid in our laps for us. The concept that muscles only, it's not only muscles, but tendons, ligaments, and even the bones in our bodies only become strong if they have to work. That the work is what we evolved for. That without the work, we wither and sicken. And we need food to chew on for our teeth and our jaws, right? We need the right level, not impossible levels of stress and work, but we need the right level of work to work on in order to be people. And the same is true to be a thinker. If you want to be able to think about the world, if you want to be able to be a feeler, to feel about the world, we need things that we can work on. And Kierkegaard says, if everything is easier and easier, what is to become of us? We're going to atrophy. We need things to be harder than that. And furthermore, hidden in this, and once you see it, you realize it's in plain sight. It's just our pop culture way of reading that makes it seem hidden from us, is a corollary. And the corollary is the road to hell is easy, but the road to heaven is difficult, right? Long is the way and hard that leads out of the hell and into the light. This is a classic quote. And Kierkegaard is a Christian, and he's a Christian not in a stereotypical pop culture way, but in a struggling, trying to understand the nature of what is good and the divine and what is true and so forth kind of way. And that leads him in his philosophy. So it is the case that if people in power want to stay in power, they need to rearrange the world so that all the actions that you could take, the ones that help them stay in power become easy for you to do. It's the natural thing to do, to take the action that protects the status quo. But so that the things that would disrupt the status quo and remove their power, they want to make it so that those things are difficult to do. They're hard to think about, they're hard to talk about, they're hard actions to take. If you take those actions, there are hard punishments. You tip the playing field to make sure nobody wants to play on the deep end and everybody wants to play on the shallow end where things are easy. And that way you protect the status quo. It's the best way, the most successful way in order to win. And as Kierkegaard points out, what follows from that is that the things that are easiest are often the things that are the worst for us. And the things that are the hardest for us are often the things that are best for us, not just because we need something to work on, but because the things that most need to be done have been rearranged to make them hard, to make them unappealing, to try to get us not to do them. And since as a result, most philosophers and inventors and geniuses, as he says, are working on the easy side of life, maybe somebody ought to be working on the hard side of life. on helping us to develop the capacity to confront those things that need to be confronted. Lisa, you got your hand up. Go ahead, come off mute.
Oh, I didn't have my hand up. I was listening intently. You're wonderful. I love this group so much.
Well, thank
Sorry
you, Lisa.
My Monday. I'll mute myself so you can continue. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, it's fine, no problem. Okay, Phil, another 7 minutes and then I can call on you. So hold that thought, sir, hold that thought. So here's Kierkegaard saying that there is merit to writing hard to read text. And if you've ever read Kierkegaard, you can understand why he would say that. What does he do in his philosophy books like Either Or Part 1? Does he just tell you what he has on his mind? No, he portrays characters who have different character types, and they tell you what's on their minds. But Kierkegaard doesn't come out and tell you what he thinks about their perspectives. He just lets you witness them as they rationalize their wants and their ideologies and so forth. So it can be a struggle to figure out what Kierkegaard is actually himself trying to tell us. He has made it difficult, but in the course of making it difficult, he has made it entertaining, because instead of him just yammering at you and saying, this is what I think and that's what I think, he's like, hey, get a load of this character. Do we know people like that? I think we do. And what about that character? We certainly know people like that. And isn't there some of them in us, so that we could learn? If we can learn to critique them, then we can learn to critique ourselves. He's taking a roundabout, more difficult way, but the result of that is richer, what you get out of it. And Kenneth Smith sticks this quote after the Nietzsche quote and after the Kafka quote right up front on the quotes page of Otherwise, because, of course, this is how he thinks about his writing. He's like, yeah, I know it's hard. Kenneth is saying, I know this isn't easy. I know there are easier things I could have written. But, says Kenneth, if I wrote those things, they could not say what this difficult text says. They couldn't, because the playing field has been rearranged so that the things that you most need to understand and think about are the hardest to think about. And the things that are not healthy for you to think, but that make you a useful tool for other people, those things are very easy to think. So if all I write is easy things, then I'm reinforcing the trap that you're in. I have to write hard things. And that means most people won't want to read them, but that's just how it is. At least it will have been said. And I've had this exact conversation with Kenneth Smith. So I married an editor. I think about editing. I'm always thinking about, isn't there an easier way to say this? And the conversation that we had is, do you have any idea how hard it is to say them at all in any way that's accurate? He says, leave it to somebody else to try to figure out if there's an easier way to say it. He says, my mission on earth is to figure out how to say it at all. So, in a way, to how to mobilize modernist misuse of language against itself, to try to open the possibility of understanding the things that modernity doesn't want you to understand about itself. And it'll be somebody else's problem too. So that's why I do these seminars that David has put together for us, is I'm trying to help unpack and explicate Kenneth Smith to create a ramp up so that people can read this way. Oh yes, Stephen, that's good. To act rationally means to act in a measured way. Let's say have a measured argument. A person might upset us because they prefer Mickey Mouse to Donald Duck. We might smack them in the face for the sake of the upset. We might say the latter act is irrational, but it remains logical. There are, logic, whether logic makes sense depends on its larger context. And since we only ever deploy logic in little fragments here and there in controlled fashion, it often means that something can be logical and illogical at the same time, because we're deploying the tool in order to achieve an irrational purpose, and vice versa. So let's go through a couple more short quotes. These ones are from the beginning of Webb's, his second volume of parables, and they continue this theme that's been developed in this first sentence of this final paragraph of section B. The first one I love so much. It's a Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He's a poet. You should hopefully have read some of him by now. The wise only possess ideas. The greater part of mankind are possessed by them. So this goes to that topic of a tool, the use of logic as a tool or reason as a tool. Moderns are taught that a mind is a thing that is also a container, and that learning and education are the process of collecting facts and putting them into the container and arranging them. And therefore, the more facts we have, the more we know, and the smarter we become, and the better a world we can make. This is the modern model of intelligence, stripped of all of its self-flattery and distraction. It is the idea that thoughts are objects, like knives or scrapers, or child's toys or religious objects, for those of you with an anthropology background, and that we pick them up and put them down, and that we wield them like toys. And what this misunderstands is the man with the hammer problem. And the man with the hammer problem is, yeah, you pick up the hammer, but the hammer picks you up too. So you start looking at the world and seeing nails everywhere. Next thing you know, you're trying to nail in rivets and screws in your neighbor's head because everything looks like a nail. The tool wields you. It changes you as you use it, so that you see the world through mirrors and lenses that make sense of the world in a hammer-like way. To yield a world in which the man with the hammer can work his will. This is the tools, the mental tools, how they really work in us. And as a result, we think that we are holding a hammer, and we're not understanding the way in which the hammer is holding us. It's possessing us as much as we're possessing it. And it's because the hammer might or might not be representable as an object. I mean, depends on what language you grew up with. Some languages, like English, love to conceive of the world as made of objects. Other languages, like Dnebizod, the Navajo language, do not conceive the world as made up of objects, but as processes and relationships. And in such a conception, a hammer is a lot more than an object. It has a history. It has come into being, and it's going to go out of being. And in the meantime, it's going to change things while it's here. It's easier in Dnebizod to understand the philosophical perspective that an idea possesses you as much as you possess it. But in English, that's almost inexpressible. An idea can't possess you because your mind is a container and you put ideas into it, and that's just how it is. In Anglo-Saxon, Old English, Anglo-Saxon has some marvelous turns of phrase. The term for a library in Anglo-Saxon translates as book hoard. Book hoard, it evokes dragons sitting on treasures. This is my hoard of books. And the term for your vocabulary that you have is your word hoard. This is my hoard of words that I possess. And if I can learn more words, I become wealthier in my vocabulary. You know, I love these old Anglo-Saxon ideas. But built into this is the idea that these things are things that you can create a hoard of. And the same is true of ideas. Knowledge, you know, in this model, knowledge could conceptually be thought of as an idea hoard. This is my hoard of ideas that I have collected. And the problem is Anglo-Saxon set us up for failure, because that is not the relationship between the human mind and an idea. Coleridge has it right. We are in some trouble. And so the frozen sea within us that needs to be broken up by an ice axe of a book is the frozen sea of the rational system of a worldview that we have constructed for ourselves, and that our ideas have constructed out of us, out of the raw material of our experiences and other ideas. They are at work in us, making the crystalline perfection and consistency that they crave to fit within as their preferred ecosystem. And we don't even notice that it's happening to us. We think we just have them. And therefore, any attempt to explain what's happening in the brain is going to be difficult and rupturing and breaking all kinds of conceptions we have, where everything has been brought into conformity with this idea hoard concept. Phil, we have reached the time. Let's break free. It's time for Phil to speak. Go forth, sir, and tell us your ideas.
Let's break that ice, yes. Well, you said a lot. It really, and my thought is that it's really the relationship between Geist and Zeitgeist. I mean, Zeitgeist move in a cyclical way in this sense. And the the first that comes up in breaking up the ice that's been impacted by the past culture is the artists, and many of them, honor the artists as an important factor in this. And it begins to, in a sense, see the complexities in the impacted nature that's been piling up and needs to be unpacked, as you say. And so it is it's a difficult task. And that reminds me of, Heidegger, when he was walking through the woods with a friend, and they came to the end of the path, and the guy said, well, I guess this is the end then. And he says, no, as a good woodsman, no, the end is only the beginning. Right? Like, because that into the end is the wellspring of new possibilities. Okay. And I made a crass comparison about, Prince Charming finally breaking through, the thorns and bushes to reach Sleeping Beauty. But that's a crass thing. And that has to do with declaring the individual. So the artist, by his very nature, is at that moment. So timeliness is the important part. At the moment that what he recognizes the end as merely the beginning, and he must begin to unpack the thing to show within the contradiction are new possibilities. Okay, and so therefore that's why it is difficult to be an Aristotle, because it's not meant at that time for things to be easy, because everybody is still living in the past, so to speak. But then I switched to the Hindu gods, and they seem to tell a story, because the Hindu gods not only have the creator god, Brahma, and the destroyer god, which is partly creativity, actually, Shiva, but also the sustainer god, Shiva, right? And Shiva is the, how should I call it? Kind of the metaphysician that sustains a tradition once it has broken through. And it could be sustained for a very long time through various stages of shorter cycles of manifestation of what do I call derivatives of the original breakthrough. Okay. But eventually, all of these derivatives get exhausted and get compacted, as you say, and it's time to call in Shiva to break up the thing again. So I thought of this, actually back in 1985. Back in 1981 when I was teaching at UNC, and I was in a seminar with a studio artist who's actually an art critic as well, and we were talking about the avant-garde, and I said, I'm not sure whether we're in the age of the icebreaker or the age of the beginning age of the sustainer. And I said, take a look at the problem of China. They had won the war. I mean, the Communist Party won the war in the 1950s. So, government society it's a bigger cycle. It is in the 1950s, we're already beginning to move into the primitive sort of social structure of an economic society, right? Because Liu Shaoqi was an economist, and he was second in command, and I guess Zhou Enlai was third in command. And Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi was purged because, the ego of Chairman Mao was too much. So he, call in the, what is it, the the 5-year cycle that essentially created a famine that killed millions of people. And then finally, he was being kind of retired and sidelined. He didn't like that. So his ego, once again, as you put it out, wanted to make a comeback because he wants to be on top and rule. And so the Cultural Revolution, the forever revolution. And, and Cho and Lai realized that, well, like we have only won the revolution. We need to develop a government, not the provisionary government for wartime, but a real government. And of course, he was also sidelined, although he never lost his position because he was too clever. And I think we have to recognize that the Geist moves in the period when the zeitgeist it must catch up, because it has to manifest a society where not everybody is an Aristotle. They have to live as well, right? And so I think the fact that we know that the zeitgeist, which is the large movement of culture, moves slower than the Aristotle in a way, it's kind of like, how to maintain in a position of being an Aristotle and sort of control the metaphysical period, rather than the ontological period, that I think becomes a kind of a problem, because the people, they do want it easy. I mean, let's face it. I mean, if you tell society, it's going to be really hard. It's going to be hard for a very long time, your whole life, as a matter of fact. Like, would you like that? I think most people will probably say, no. I mean, when we're talking about, we have 7.9% inflation, people are already panicking,
Yeah.
and I don't blame them in a way, okay? So in a sense, there's this relationship that you have to develop a new structure, a new understanding, but people do not have the capacity or the will to continue on this sort of, emergent possibilities. They want to, settle down, have a white picket fence, have 2.5 kids, and the whole bit. So I think that if you're going to be an Aristotle, you have to realize that that's just the way it is. In fact, I had a friend I had a discussion with about at that time, a tiny bit later, and he said, people are always complaining it's so hard to be an artist, right? And he said, no, they should make it harder. Like, if you're an artist, you're going to be thrown in prison. Then we're going to find out who's a real artist, right? Because what you're doing when you're making that kind of complaint, you're not a real artist. You're a derivative artist to try to sustain yourself. That's, and culture. Okay, that's fine. So that's what I want to say, is that you have to understand that you're in this cycle, and when you're an Aristotle of any sort, then you have to understand, that you have to lay low, continue in your thing, and you have to not be submerged into this sort of metaphysical period.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Good stuff. It was so worth waiting for. Thank you. So I wrapped up with Coleridge at the moment. And one of the key phrases that links this, part of the reason why this is here, is because the greater part of mankind, Phil was talking about, are possessed by them. The greater part of mankind maps directly onto that first sentence that ends with the minds of ordinary men. Who are these ordinary men who he's talking about? In previous weeks, we talked about the fact that the ordinary men who can't comprehend the eristic commitment to intrinsic truth, that they're douloi and benausoi. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about people whose whole characters are shaped by, on the one hand, the griff, for the more slavish mentality, or by Verstand, for the more intellectualized mentality. But in both cases, they're a kind of slave. They're slaves to their character. They can't question their character. The doulos can't conceive of the concept that what they want is going to hurt them. right? Heraclitus can say till he turns blue in the face, it would not be better for men to get what they want, because we want the wrong things. And our wants are cultivated in us and used as leashes to leash us into, engines of production, in which the pursuit of our desires makes the world worse, rather than better. It's not that it has to be that way, but it's that if we don't understand our relationship to our wants, then it will be used that way, because it's such an easy way to control us. It's like the legal concept of an attractive nuisance. You leave an old swimming pool without a fence around it, full of old water, and you're legally liable for the fact that kids are going to jump into it. It's not their fault because it's attractive. It's just lying right there begging to be used, and they're going to want to use it even if it's dangerous. Soon you have kids jumping off of roofs into this old dangerous swimming pool, and it is like that for human beings to have desires and yet not be conscious of the danger that their desire presents to themselves and others. Right? It's not safe to raise human beings with that blind spot. If you're going to raise douloi, and you don't have much choice because a lot of people grow up that way for whatever reason, which we don't understand yet. If you're going to have douloi, they need to be enlightened douloi who know about themselves, who have been taught, who have stories, rich, wonderful stories to remind themselves over and over of the dangers of their own desires. And, as Stephen says, machine assisted desire, a whole technology, a whole industry, a whole machine world dedicated to maximizing and pumping up your desires, an advertising industry that gets you all hot and bothered for the things you don't have and makes you want to buy. That frenzy is what the modern world is built out of, which is exactly what Heraclitus told us not to do. So the greater part of mankind are possessed by them, includes douloi. They're possessed by ideas because the ideas are linked to their desires, and they're possessed by their desires. They're possessed by their feelings, their fears, their sensations, their experiences, their memories. But it's the same for the intellectuals. The intellectuals are possessed by their ideas more directly because they're ideologues. They buy into ideological systems. Their whole identity comes from ideological systems. In the military, what is your grade? Oh, I'm a lieutenant. That's who I am. That's my very identity. Or in a corporation, I'm a general manager. Oh yeah, well, I'm an executive manager. Oh yeah, well, I'm in the suite above that. Where are you on the ladder defining your existence? What is your role that you do in the world to help other people make money, being who you are and going on your badge, right? I am, so and so. There's a name, but the important part is what's under it in the smaller type. I'm a executive assistant. That's what I am. That's my identity, that I play this function. And in all of these things, the system has become the dominant defining force, and the logic of the system, how promotions work, the money involved, the experience involved, and so forth. All that systematization has become a replacement for authentically living. It's become a framework. It's exactly the same in a different expression. It's the same for master craftsmen, people who work their way up in industry, learning to get better and better at it. In a union or not in a union, in a guild. How good are you at this technology that you are wielding? Is almost always, it has to be broken up into a ladder so that we can distinguish who's competent to do which jobs from who's not competent to do which jobs. And thus we end up again with linear sequences and people defining themselves by where they are, time and grade, what skills have you acquired, what tests can you pass, what certifications do you have? And next thing you know, your diplomas and certifications become a replacement for actually looking at you. Endless corporations buy people on the basis of their paperwork. They have the appropriate paperwork that defines who they are. And thus the interviewers don't have to actually do the very difficult work of finding out who they actually are, which typically has no relationship to the pieces of paper. You come out of med school, most hospitals will not let you within 10 feet of most patients by yourself, unattended, right? I mean, you have a head full of theory. And yeah, you've had some time in hospitals. You had to in order to get this far. But the next step in your profession is not, now I'm a doctor and I can do whatever I want. The next step in your profession is, we're going to watch you closely and work with you with training wheels to develop the Gnosis until it develops to the point that it equals the Oasis, and you're fit to actually turn loose with patients, because they have learned the hard way, when life and death is on the line, that the systematic, intellectual, rational, logical, mathematical definition of something is not at all the same thing as what it truly is. And if only the rest of our society could work that way. So this thing about possessing ideas and being possessed by them also goes hand in hand with this opening sentence. The ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth, the ethos, the character of committing to intrinsic truth, committing to what nature has to tell us about what's real, instead of what we wish were real, what we desire to be real as a doulos, or what we ideologically calculate to be real as a banausos. Katafuse is presented as the heuristic equivalent to desires and ideologies. It's the source of truth for an Aristos, and they need it. They need access to it in the same way that a doulos needs access to their desires, and a banausos needs access to their ideology, because without it, they don't know how to figure out true from false and right from wrong. So that's what Coleridge is doing in this mix. Let's go back to Kierkegaard, because if you're going to talk about delusions, you always need a healthy heaping dose of Kierkegaard. This is also from the opening of Webb's, and comes right after the Coleridge quote. A delusion is a state of mind in which one is least able to think of that which one most needs to think. If only I didn't misspell that. That would be embarrassing. Why don't I replace that S with an A? But yes, this isn't exactly, by the way, how Kierkegaard words it in his book, but this is what he means by it. The way he words it is entirely in keeping with this. This is how it was worded for an early edition of Bartlett's Quotations that was influential on Kenneth. You'll occasionally see these quotes from Kenneth that aren't literally what somebody said, but that he puts it that way consistently. And these are all because of a certain 1960s edition of Bartlett's, where a certain editor went through and had a helping hand, helped himself to the editor's pencil and rewrote a whole bunch of famous quotes. And that influenced an entire generation of people in America and around the world about what they think people said. But in this case, the rewrite is still pretty close to what Kierkegaard said. He's saying that if it doesn't do this, it's not a delusion. This is how you know what a delusion is, or an ideology, that it is constructed in a circular fashion, such that once you're inside of it, you can't get out of it. It's like a Mobius strip for the mind, Kenneth has said at other times. And you could travel as far as you want, but you're always going to end up on the same side, because there is only one side. Everything has become twisted around so that there is no possibility of another side. It's excluded. It's a flatland for the mind in which a sphere passing through can't get any purchase because it's incomprehensible and inexpressible. This is the nature of douleia, the doulic mindset. And this is the nature of banauseia, the banausic mindset. That each of those ways of seeing the world, that becomes an identity, turns back upon itself in such a way that it doesn't seem to leave anything out, and it also doesn't leave anything unexplained. If you're a doulos and you're understanding everything in a live wire begriff kind of way, you have an understanding of everything. And by everything, we mean everything that you're capable of perceiving. There are things you're not capable of perceiving, but you're not capable of perceiving that you are not perceiving everything. Douleia rules out the idea that it's excluding anything. And of that set that it draws of all the things that constitute reality, it gives you the strategy for how to understand them. But that is how to misunderstand them in a way that's satisfying to yourself. That's what it means to use a worldview or a lens system. They're all delusions. In fact, they're all whole galaxies and constellations of self-reinforcing delusions that mutually reinforce the whole picture of the worldview. And from a dualic perspective, it's all experiential. You know, down to your bones, because you have lived this life, that you are seeing things the way they really are. You know it. There isn't any, it's not even a hubristic claim. You're just certain. And the same is true for a Banausos, but with a different key. That Banauseia, the mindset and character possibilities, the whole worldview that gets generated like a miasma or a labyrinth or a web out of the Banausic, out of the Verstand mode of thinking, it also seems to explain everything. It gives you a way to understand everything. It doesn't seem to leave anything out. And it does that in the same two ways that Duleia does what it does. That is, first, it suppresses enormous amounts of the world so that you can't see them, and you can't see that you can't see them. As far as you can tell, as a Banausos, you see everything, right? And furthermore, of the things you say that you see, they are all warped to make sense in a Banausic way, and only in a Banausic way. So that, first of all, it's compatible with the Banausic strategy, but second of all, it reinforces what must be the virtuousness of the Banausic strategy, because look, there's literally nothing that you can encounter that doesn't make sense to you. And what's missing from the picture is the understanding of both of those liabilities. You can't understand that just because you understand something doesn't mean you understand it he auto, in itself, or kata fuse, according to nature. The mismatch between the understanding that satisfies you as a Banausos and the understanding that would be true, but would challenge your Banauseia and make it seem like your entire worldview is flawed, that mismatch is incomprehensible to a Banausos. So as a result, they don't see it. They can't see what they're warping, because they're seeing with warped eyes that make it look unwarped. And likewise, the things that Banauseia doesn't admit to existing can't be left out because they're non-things. They're nothings, like unicorns and dragons, right? The Banausos says, the only things being left out are untruths. Why would I want to include an untruth in my hoard of truths? That doesn't make sense. So it's good that that my worldview excludes all those falsehoods. That way, my worldview only sees the things that are real. And by real, we mean Banausic, Noetic, purchasable, all the nails for our hammer. That's what we see. And all the non-nails either look like nails or we don't see them. And that's how a delusion works. This is why Kenneth Smith calls both of these mentalities slave mentalities. Says nobody has to put a shackle on you because you're putting the shackle on yourself while denying that there's a shackle. You can't see that it's happening because the very self-shackling you're doing is among the things that your worldview excludes from the possibilities of reality. It's unseeable, unthinkable, and thus you can't worry about it. You can't struggle. You can't engage in a heuristic life of struggling against your own shackles when you know you don't have any. This is going to come up over and over. Stephen has been raising for months this question of Gleipnir. What is the shackle that bound Fenris, who could not be bound? How did they do it? And what does that mean? And we're going to get to it over the weeks ahead because it's in the second sentence. But this is our first direct implication of what he's been suggesting this whole time. The shackle consists of the things that are unthinkable, the nothings. are what bind the doulos to douleia and the benausos to benauseia. The structure of the delusion, the motive force by which it keeps you trapped is through the nothings that it convinces you are in fact nothing. That's how you're held. So going back to that first sentence, aristocrats, i.e. aristoi, are distinguished by an ethos of commitment to intrinsic truth, not to dualic truth, which is based on how we feel about it, and not based on banausic truth, which is based on how it satisfies a logical system, but are based on intrinsic truth, the truth that is in nature, whether we see it or not, whether we like it or not, whether we have a theory for it or not, whether it pleases us or not, but it's there anyway, the authoritativeness of the truth of nature. That is what an Aristos is committed to. And in that commitment, it creates a rupture between the dualic worldview and intrinsic truth. There's no fit there. And if you insist on the intrinsic truth, you break the soap bubble, the crazy house of mirrors through which you've been seeing, because now you have a surd, an inexpressible idea sitting right there out in the open where you can see it and can't look away from it. It breaks up your commitment to the dualic delusion. And the same is true for the benausic delusion, right? How does the statement go? All my beautiful theories thrown asunder by one ugly fact, right? Ugly facts, the anomalies that we wish to put on the shelf, that we wish to exclude from the statistics of our studies, right? Those things, those are surds, they're inexpressible within our theory. There's no place for them. And as surds, if we insist on them, if we have an ethos of commitment to the intrinsic truth of real things, even when they're surds, then it ruptures our banausic envelope and shows the threadbare nature of logic when it comes to the truth. Logic can establish validity. It cannot establish truth. Only nature can establish truth. This is part of where an Aristos comes from. And so the eristic commitment is so visceral because they understand the nature of the trap that douloi and banausoi are trapped in, and that they themselves were trapped in their lives, and that keeps pulling at them and singing its seductive siren songs to them, saying, come back, it's nice here, you'll feel certain, you'll feel good, it's lovely, stop struggling, just let go, live for the day. Blended, look at all the rewards waiting for you if you'll just use your gifts for the common good, by which we mean if you'll just fit yourself into a bureaucracy, right? Just sign up, sign your soul away right here, and we'll get rid of all those messy problems that have been bothering your brain, and you'll be able to settle right in, and everything will make sense again. And aristoi, the reaction to that is contempt and disgust. And if they didn't have that level of strength of contempt and disgust, they couldn't resist the siren song, because it's so good, it's so sweet, it's so appetizing, and it never stops. And that tells you how visceral their commitment is. So when he talks about the inventive and narcotized minds of ordinary men, he's talking about Kierkegaard's quote about a delusion and all the implications that that has. They are living in a perpetual state of delusion. And in that state, the things that matter most to Aristoi are inexpressible surds that they have no commitment to, and that they therefore suppress into the background of life. They become non-things, nothings. And thus, their douleia and benauseia, respectively, are kept whole. And they don't have to struggle. They can just stay in the womb of their soap bubble life without ever having it ruptured. So that's how Kierkegaard is relevant to this quote. This is why he opens otherwise with that run of quotes. And that leads to the next quote in the series, another favorite of mine, which is Auden, W.H. Auden, the poet. We are lived by powers we pretend to understand. We think we're picking up a hammer, but in fact, an ideology is picking us up. And it has power over us, but we think it doesn't. We think it's just a thing, and that we understand what we're doing when we pick it up and begin to hammer a nail. We are lived by powers we pretend to understand. There's an Oscar Wilde quote from De Profundis that goes on at some length, but it starts out, most people are other people, right? The things that they do in their lives that they think are most individually them are actually just mimicry of other people, and their mimicry of their actions and their mimicry of their ideologies. And in so doing, when we do that, we cease to be an individual, and instead we just become a copy. Maybe it's a collage of copies. And we say, well, I'm unique because no one has ever put this particular collage together again before. But the problem is there's nothing in it that's unique. It's all just mimicry of other people. And more specifically, in a Kierkegaardian sense, it is symptomatic of the delusion more than it is expressive of any actual authentic individual, right? If all you are is a classical doulos, then what's the point of you? We have billions of douloi, and they're all thinking the way you are about themselves and about the world. And we have billions of banausoi who are all going through their checklists and following the little steps in their logic and pleasing their superiors and looking for their next promotion, making their payment on their house. And adding one more banausos to the list doesn't change the world or make it better in any way. It just perpetuates the machine. The question is, what can you do that does not comply with power, that does not fit into these patterns, that is something that you would not expect to see anywhere inside either of these two wombs? And when you start engaging in those sorts of behavior, you start to be an individual. You start to do something new, different, something that the world might need, that it doesn't have enough of. But more of the same old isn't going to get us out of the trap that we're in. So when we say when he says we are lived by powers we pretend to understand, part of what's in this is the topic of individuation. To what extent are you even an individual versus to what extent are you a shadow on a cave wall? Just like all the other shadows on the cave wall being cast by, the puppeteers. I'm sort of grossly exaggerating here in the way that I'm expressing this, but that's because I think you all get the gist of this out in quote. The other thing that's worth pulling out about Ouden before I call on Ginny here is this concept that it's powers living through us. Powers living through us. Obviously, you start talking about power, you start talking about Nietzsche. But also, if you talk about powers, you're talking about energies, which means you're talking about dynamic systems, which means now you're talking about Heraclitus and the dialectic. So bound up in this Ouden quote, there are connections to ancient Greek philosophy and existentialist philosophy. There's a reason why Kenneth Smith pulls all this in the way that he does. And you better believe anytime Kenneth is writing something about understanding, about pretense, about living, about what it means to be an individual, about powers, he's got this Ouden quote in mind. It's right there, right? It is almost for me too. I think about this one a lot. It's not always present for me the way it is for Kenneth, but it's often present. I think about it a lot. And as you get to the point where you have your own horde of these little parables and paradigms and paradoxes, the more of these you sort of collect into your horde and have at your fingertips, the easier and easier it gets to read Kenneth Smith, even relatively quickly, eventually, and begin to see the full import of what he's writing, because these were the things he had at his fingertips. All right, Ginny, go ahead and come off mute.
No, I liked the fact that what you said about Oscar Wilde, even the title of his play, like The Importance of Being Earnest.
Yes.
Just listen to the title, The Importance of Being Earnest,
Yes.
So I like that comparison you just made about Oscar Wilde. I like that.
Yeah. Oscar Wilde, he was a deep thinker.
But you would never know it looking at him, the way he used to dress like a fob, not fob, but he was really into dressing up.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he
Um,
enjoyed the play. He enjoyed the mimicry.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
no,
like
you're
that
right.
play, The Importance of Being Earnest. I've
Yes.
done scenes from that play, and it's a lot of fun.
Thank you, Jenny. Yeah, this is a point I meant to make earlier and I forgot, but I'm going to take Jenny's comment here as an opportunity. The importance of being earnest is a play on words, right? Because, you want to be candid and honest, and that's one sense of earnest, but also earnest could be like a dude. The importance of being, who you are, of being, or of being a mimicry of some other dude. There's this whole question of identity that's hiding in there. The title means at least those two things at the exact same time. This idea of trying to write things in a way that they can give multiple meanings at the same time was very dear to the Greeks. We've mentioned this before. Before the age of Socrates, there was an age in which the sages, as they called them, of Greece, strove to write these dense nuggets of text that could be profound. It could be wisdom literature that you could consume in one bite at a time, but that took a lot of chewing because they had so many implications. You had to really think about them. Like Know Thyself was a product of that generation of wisdom literature. So the thing is, philosophers like Heraclitus were steeped in that condensation of meaning approach to wisdom literature. And as a result, they were striving with all their might to do plays on language that would allow them to accomplish that. So let's go back to the Coleridge quote for a moment, because I meant to bring this up with this one. The first clause, the wise only possess ideas, right? The greater part of mankind are possessed by them. There's two ways to read that. The wise only possess ideas, right? They have them. They actually do possess them, is one of the implications of that. The use of the word only here. In English, adverbs can float, right? As you know, you've probably all seen the internet meme that shows what happens if you move an adverb to every possible position in a sentence and it changes the meaning. And it's hilarious how different it is in English. It's one of the things that English can do that's reminiscent of ancient Greek in some sense. But in ancient Greek, it could do it without moving, because position isn't as important in ancient Greek. So the wise only possess ideas is one way to read it. But another way to read it is the wise only possess ideas. Nobody but the wise can possess ideas. Everybody else is possessed by them. The first sense suggests that the wise can possess an idea without being possessed by it. And the second sense is only the wise can pull this off. That right there is the kind of thing that Nietzsche was talking about when he said, I want to say in 10 sentences what somebody else says in a book. He says, I want to encode meaning in these sentences so that you really have to stop and look at them from multiple angles to see everything they have to tell you. This kind of word trick is one of the techniques that they use. And it's one of the techniques that Heraclitus used all the time, and that Aristotle used all the time. Aristotle said, man is a political animal. It's one of his most famous lines out of the Politics. Man is a political animal. And what does he mean by that? Well, this is ancient Greek, not English. So he means several things at exactly the, and he grew up in this wisdom literature. So he means several things at exactly the same time. And part of what he means is, it is katefuse, as animals, according to nature. It is our nature that we need politics. We need to negotiate with each other. Without negotiating with each other, we can't survive. And ergo, politics is core to us in the same way that running is core to a cheetah. But in Greek, you could rearrange the sentence and you can find other meanings in it. And those who engage in this kind of poetic philosophy do it on purpose. So he also means that only a political animal is truly human. People who pride themselves on not getting involved in politics are not fully human. Aristotle means that. And if you read his book, it is abundantly clear that he means that. He knows about the douloi and banausoi. I mean, these are Greek terms. He knows about the liabilities that human people are prey to. He says those people have a sub-political character. To them, politics is what they want or what they think. It's not genuine politics. Ergo, if you let them into politics, they're going to distort it, corrupt it, and try to pull it down to their level, to the level that they understand. They're going to try to make it into a con game for ripping off other people, or they're going to try to make it into a system in which they can go through the world thoughtlessly as a cog in a machine with a system of endless laws that it's impossible to fully comprehend. Or they're just going to try to exploit it as a way to get the things that they want or that they think other people want. Desire and ideology are the way that a doulos or banausos will attempt to do politics and corrupt them. And ergo, people like that, being subpolitical, are not fully human. In the same way a child is not fully human. Now, in our modernist culture, we idolize the child, at least in words. In deeds, they are often miserable. We often immiserate children. But, in our words, we talk about how sacred they are and how important they are and how we have to think of the children, right? It's the rallying cry of every other populist movement is think of the children. But the problem is, they're children. They haven't finished developing into mature human beings. Some of them want to put their hands on a hot stove. Some of them want to jump off the roof with an umbrella, right? I mean, all of these things, you can't run a country this way. It is just not safe. They need help developing into becoming, hopefully becoming, mature adult human beings who are fit to govern. There is a stage of that names do come to mind as I'm speaking right now. There is a stage of development. There's multiple stages of development that they have to go through before they become human, in the sense that Aristotle meant when he said man is a political animal. I mean, sure, Aristotle doubtless would have loved his children, but he didn't love them the way we love our children, where he pretended that they're the most important and most sacred things. The Greeks, when they talked about the dates in which somebody lived, they wouldn't tell you the day they were born or the day they died. They didn't care. They gave you the years in which they flourished, in which they were at their highest, at their acme, in which they were most themselves and contributed the most to the world. It's one of the things that really frustrated later academics when they were trying to work out when different people live, is that the Greeks mostly wouldn't tell them. So like, who cares? Who cares when you're a squalling baby? That's not interesting. The interesting thing is, at what point did you challenge Athens and become a social gadfly? That's interesting, Socrates. That's what we want to know. These are the years in which he taught and finally confronted and was put to death by the legislature. That was his fleuroit, his years of flourishing. Those are the important parts, not the childhood, because the childhood is a sub-political existence, according to the ancient Greeks, and thus not yet fully human. Like potential human, could someday, if we do things right, could grow up to become human. So when he says man is a political animal, he's not just thinking about children, he's thinking about douloi and banausoi. You can't let systematizers and pinheads and con artists and drive-by idiots and trolls run your government, or you get the modern world. This is what happens when you let these people govern. They're not fit to govern. They are characterologically driven to do everything except govern. And if they get their hands on the wheels of governance, they'll use it to abuse each other, because that's what they are characterologically driven to do, because they are not political animals and thus not fully human. This is Aristotle speaking, right? I'm explicating the implications. When he says man is a political animal, we read past it and go, well, there's a claim. Or I suppose he is a little bit, we might think. Or I see, that's profound, we might think. But what we don't think is what he meant when he wrote it, which is that people who aren't capable of engaging at the political level aren't fully human and need caretakers in order to limit the damage that they do in the world. Now, for us, that's ideologically unacceptable because we are all created equal and everybody's free. We all have access to the truth. We all act with enlightened self-interest. We're all reasonable men. Right? The jury theory says this, capitalist theory says this, all these different parts of modernity, they all say what we are in a banausic sense. Ergo, according to the Verstand structure of the modern world, those things must be true regardless of whether or not they are actually true in nature. We are required to act as though they are. We're required to disregard the evidence to the contrary, even if it's right in front of our eyes. Even if literally they're burning down the house, we must pretend that none of this is happening because our ideology is more important than our reality. If anything distinguishes Aristotle, it is that on every subject he wrote, he always wanted to begin by going to nature and saying, at its essence, at its root, at the radical level, what is a thing in its own before we start getting our ideologies involved? What is it kata fusei? So when he says man is a political animal, he's trying to strike to the heart of what it means to be an adult and how our species actually works. I'm going to do James and then Donald and then Phil, even though Phil's been waiting the longest. This is the timer on half-hour breaks between talking. So let's go with James. Go ahead, James. Come off mute.
Yeah, all these quotes from Kierkegaard and Alden and the other ones, the importance of being earnest. These seem to have a kind of a point to the relationship between the individual and the other, and that it's a lack of understanding of one's relationship with the other. That is perhaps the kind of a source of this problem of understanding what is true and what is false, right? A sense of identity, self-identity.
Yeah.
And so is that related to like the kind of dialectical logic, the ability to understand, the ability to negate, like you say, cracking the icebergs of your inner self or something like that?
Yes.
So it's the ability to thinking. Part of thinking is the process. Is this process of cultivation or kind of getting into attacking your own convictions or something like that.
That's
where
right.
you're able to negate what you think and how you think, and because that's part of the real process of thinking, right?
That's right.
So
That's
it's really the negation, the power of negation in dialectical thinking that maybe it's lacking, and that the Greeks understood that or had that ability because they read, influenced by Heraclitus and Parmenides, and the pre-Socratic seem to have that kind of seem to have explored that area of thinking, right?
Yeah, and what's interesting is the writing about Heraclitus and others that suggests that they didn't invent any of these ideas, that what they were doing was trying to put into words a really dynamic dialectical worldview that was built into the Greek religion. The nature of their polytheism was such that it involved conflict, right? With monotheism, you can sort of create an illusion that there's no conflict and that it's all working out according to God's one mysterious plan, because who does he have to argue with? Nobody's at his scale. But in a polytheism, especially where it's supposed to be representing archai or principles of nature, it's immediately obvious that they conflict with each other in various ways. And it's as the priests of the Eleusinian mysteries or the Orphic mysteries or what have you, as they wrestled with these questions. What does it mean when Artemis and Apollo argue? What is happening? It inevitably led them to the concept of the dialectic and a dynamic cosmos. And that was all included in within the mystery religions and probably within the main Olympian rites and rituals as well. He talks about, Heraclitus has a line where he talks about a sacred drink, a barley drink that's used in the Eleusinian mysteries at a key point. And the only way it works as a drink is if you keep stirring it. If you stop stirring it, then half of it settles back out to the bottom and it's not that drink anymore. And in this, they're teaching a lesson in a tangible and tasty way to understand that some things only exist because of the dynamics that keep moving them so that they remain in suspension. So there are some really sophisticated concepts that are coming right out of the religion. And these early pre-Socratics, what they're doing is they're putting it into words for the first time. They're extracting the principles that underlie them and writing them down so that then once they're written down, they can be, discussed and argued about and so forth. The Eleusinian mysteries, it was said, they were incredibly powerful emotionally. They had something to do with the cycles of nature and the understanding that even though we must die, other people will come along and they'll be the new season of people. That through that, if we nurture the earth enough while we're here, then when they're born and their time comes, they'll have richer soil to grow from and be able to go further than we did. There's a lot of kind of how to reconcile yourself with death and so forth that's pretty profound and bound up in the mysteries, but we'll never know because everybody who went through the Eleusinian rites swore an oath never to tell anybody what they saw. That's the one thing that we know about them for sure, is that they had to keep it to themselves. And as a result, when Christianity destroyed the rites under the Eastern Orthodox Church, we lost it. We don't really know what was involved. We just have fragments. But what we do know is from this line by Heraclitus and a few others, we know that a great deal of Heraclitus's philosophy of nature was just lifted straight out of Eleusinian mysteries. And so that means these go back among the Greeks. We don't know how many centuries. They might go back to the Homeric age, to the Mycenaean and Minoan eras. They might go back thousands of years. We don't know. But we do know that some of this same sense of nature as a dynamism and source of authority, you can see in other indigenous cultures unrelated to them around the world. It's probably the case that anybody who lives close to nature with limited technology, for them to survive at all, they have to learn how nature really works. The ones who don't are gone, and the ones who survived are the ones who figured out these dynamic cycles and the dialectic and so forth. And then religions that developed later would encode these things as rites and rituals. So that's what we understand about the origins of the dialectic and things like this, is that really it's in nature, and anybody who spends enough time knocking heads with nature is either going to knock themselves out or they're going to learn the lessons. Donald, go ahead. Come off mute.
First, to Jenny, one of the courses I did take from Kenneth was, I think, social and political philosophy. And Kenneth began with, man is a herd animal, rather like cows. And we have to work out how to live together. That's what politics is, the active working of a herd animal to structure their herd. And I don't know what that observation has to do with anything, but since we're all equal and free, a guiding thing in modernity is consent of the governed. The governed must consent. But we don't exactly say, well, I guess we naively assume that we express our consent through voting or something. But I think the Greeks, there's a way to read in Plato's Republic, what we call in the Republic the noble lie is a mythic structure by which those that don't rule can see the rulers. I mean, the noble lie is all men are brothers, as they're brothers, as equally men, but as those who may rule, so that they can, in a sense, consent to an aristocracy. I know that sounds strange, but I think it's actually, the Greeks thought about this, that the douloi and the merchants and the douloi, the slaves, had to somehow participate in it and understand something to their limits about its correctness or rightness and its ability to provide good governance. After all, the douloi could have seized power by force of arms. So could in fact, the Banasoi could have done it even easier, because they were all the arms manufacturers and stuff. Yeah. And were often wealthier than the real aristocrats, the ones who were, I don't know, you don't have, I guess we have oligarchy for that, but there ought to be a Gnostic art. I mean, this is be like here, but like in the Republic, he goes down and he sees what's the old man's name? Means Greek word for brain, kind of. But he got wealthy making arms. He was just made armor. You know, he lived in the Piraeus, but he probably had the means, not willing to consent to overthrow. Certainly the tyrants overthrew the aristocracy numerous times. So I think there was some concern, even in the Greeks. How can we have an aristocracy, and how can the people that aren't citizens still feel like they consent to this? So modernity's not moving that way, but maybe we could think more broader about that. Stephen said something.
Thanks, Donald. Yeah, there's a Frederick Douglass quote that says, I'm going to completely rewrite what he said, but with the same meaning. It is that there's no such thing as governance without consent. People think there is, but tyrants can only oppress you to the level that you let them oppress you. There are always more of you than there are of them. And if you all choose not to rise up and overthrow the tyrant, then he's going to give you as much oppression as you'll tolerate. And that's how it works. He says, there's people who want freedom without having to struggle for it. They don't want there to be revolutions. They don't want there to be uprisings. They don't want there to be violence. He says, that's like people who want crops without the torrential rain. It's like there's going to be struggle and stress to get the things that you need, whether you like it or not. And part of what Donald's talking about is expressing this notion that even in the Greek aristocracy, as a form of government, there is still governance of the consent of the governed, in the sense that when things became too intolerable at various points in Greek history, they did rise up and overthrow the oligarchs. So that always remains an option, even when it's a difficult or distant one. It's harder in the modern world, where we have such extreme levels of technology that allow us to have weapons of destruction at a scale never conceived of before, because now tyrants can just blackmail the whole world and say, well, sure, you could overthrow me, but I can destroy everything. I'll just fire off all these nukes and you'll all die. If I can't have it, nobody can have it. It becomes an option now in a way that it never was before in history. But it still doesn't change the fact that that doesn't prevent us from overthrowing the government, right? I mean, we're making a choice. to yield to the blackmail when we do that. And it doesn't mean that it's our fault, but it does say something about the nature of responsibility. Phil, go ahead. You've been waiting, and you've got something great to say, and we're eager to hear it.
Well, I'm not sure if I got something great to say, but I'll say it anyway. So, like, I always wanted to, in a sense, stress that Western civilization did not begin with the Greeks, but with the Egyptians, right? It ought to be extended. And partly because it's not attributed to that is because, like, Egypt is like, a mystery wrapped in an enigma. And so therefore, all we have, although we're learning more about the actual history of Egypt slowly through archaeology, still, even if we got a full picture, I think the myth of Egypt is actually truer than whatever we will expose the reality to truly be. And my thought is that to what degree is injustice to suffer? I mean, is justice to suffer the tyranny of injustice without some sort of redemption? And my thought is, in some sense, like, yeah, that is the myth of Osiris and Seth. Okay. Both Osiris and Seth were the son of Atum, which is eventually Ra, or the sun god, Atum Ra. And so, in some sense, they were both gods. Now, Osiris was given the rulership of the earth because he was the god of life, of nature, of production, okay? But they didn't really muscle Seth because they said that there was something about Seth that was very creative, that was very important. So they let him be, but they sort of told Seth, like, control yourself, right? Okay. But you know that, of course, eventually Seth was the god of measurements. And he created this beautiful box and trapped Osiris in it, and he threw it into the river, and then it was discovered later by Isis, and then he got Osiris again and chopped them up in small bits and threw them in the Nile again. And out of that, like the trees and everything, his parts of the body bloomed, and he was the god of life. But in a sense, he finally was, you could say, I could say, provisionally defeated. So instead of ruling the earth now, he was ruling the afterlife, right? The underworld. So the history of Egypt is the history of the Book of the Dead, right? Because Osiris is forever banished, and of course, the production of measurements is what we have in civil society, in contemporary society, right? That produces all these things. And so that myth seems to be a very important one, is that Osiris still, in a sense, ruled because he was in the afterlife. He was able to judge whether somebody lived a true and pure life by weighing their heart, and that they lived a true and generous life. The heart would weigh less than a feather, and they would be allowed. Okay, so that's interesting. It's like, that to me sounds a teeny bit like the Christian myth, except is not up but down,
Mhm.
right? So
Mhm.
this is a rulership that this seems to be somehow, not in heaven, but in earth. I guess Osiris still the earth god because he was a god of nature. So you could keep that in mind. So that's kind of interesting. Is like, yeah, we have now lived in the world of Seth in which measurements produce all these marvelous things, that maybe we have forgotten Osiris.
Mhm.
Well, he's dead and buried. Like, who the hell cares? And the civilization eventually died. So, and Osiris couldn't fight himself because he was cut to bits, and then he was dead. He was in a dead world, and it was only his son Horus who continues to fight. Osiris's name in the
Yeah.
real life.
Yeah.
So, can Horus act, who's a third generation god, actually defeat his uncle? So that's an interesting thing, and it reminds me a little bit of Antigone as well.
course.
But in some sense, I mean, I think in that myth, it's interesting. It's like, and I remember once I was in a lecture and somebody was lecturing about what's his name, the radical uh, progressive guy who was with God, I'm forgetting everybody's name, who was in the Cuban Revolution. What was it?
Castro?
No, not
Oh,
Castro.
you're talking about the guy who traveled South America
Yeah, that's right.
on a motorcycle.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
So anyway, and she was, I'm not sure if I believe in his move, but I do believe that that in that myth, he was fighting for the just cause. And I asked her, like, can you really ask an ordinary person to die in Bolivia, being hunted down by the CIA? Could you really ask people to live that heroic life, which is essentially the heroic life that almost approaches the heroic life of Osiris? I mean, right? I mean, no, you can't really ask people that. You could maybe show him as an example of what could be, but you can't really ask people to do that. That's just too much to ask ordinary people.
Yeah.
So my thought is that I think that really creates a problem, is because you don't have enough of those people who will die for the cause. And in the case of Osiris, live in the underworld for the cause.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
there we have the problem.
Frankensteinian stitched together, body.
So that really is a problem that we face, and some of us do see injustice, getting the dominant hand. But in some sense, I was like, how far should I be? Am I going to go as far as like fighting in Bolivia at 100,000, or do I want to go as far as Osiris? I don't know. I mean,
Yeah. Well, the playing field has been, as we say, made in such a way that most of us do not want to go there.
Yeah.
Which I think is your core point. Yeah. Yeah, that's right, Phil. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. I continue, I continue to be impressed by Set as a metaphor for Oasis, and Isis and Osiris as metaphors for Gnosis. I think you're onto something there. I think that's probably what they had in mind, because the fact that measurement has been tied to Osiris cut into pieces, it goes hand in hand with the way a modern believes that a hand is a part of his body, as though there's a factory somewhere that makes them and then we bolt them on. That's not at all what happens. And the actual truth of our relationship to our hand is so organic and so alien to the modern worldview, including the worldview of English, we don't really even have words that mean what a hand means to us. It's basically absurd. It's inexpressible. What is this if it's not a part? And the answer is something we cannot really say, but that other cultures had an easier time with because they didn't have our mechanistic, parts-oriented view of the world. It's the thingliness of our worldview that makes us want these things to be parts. It makes us have an easier time with a disassembled skeleton than we do with a whole person. We want to describe the person in terms of the parts of the skeleton. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, getting back to the question of Gleipnir,
Yes.
this is what I want you to take back to Kenneth.
Yes.
In the legend, they try to bind Fenrir with two previous chains,
Yes.
a great chain and an even greater chain, and both of these fail. Now, there's a reason why both fail, and it's a common anecdote about chains, and you should be able to work that one out.
Yes.
Yes. I'll give you a little bit of time because it's such a common anecdote about chains. This is the reason why those first two mighty chains fail. And actually, it brings into the question that when we discuss philosophy, and this is my huge problem. I'm certainly not the smartest man around, but everywhere I go on these philosophical forums, people don't even have a basic grasp of what rationality is.
Right.
And that's a big problem.
It is.
Okay, that's my bit.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I did a bunch of reading and writing this morning about Gleipnir. I have although we're not getting to it this week, I have a whole thing written up on it. And the more I was writing up on it, the more I was appreciating you for bringing it before us. So the previous two attempts to bind Fenris, those previous two chains, they have names too. And I wrote all that down. I didn't know that before this morning. Very interesting stuff. All right, I got 3 more quotes, and it probably takes us through the end of today. But if it doesn't, then we'll be able to start into sentence 2. So let's go to the next quote. Next quote is from Paul Valéry, one of our favorites, but one who's not well known. The famous quote about past ages having gone down in the abyss of time like great sunken ships. That's Paul Valéry. But this is the Valéry quote that he put right after the Auden quote in the opening of Otherwise. He says, "Our means of investigation and action have far outstripped our means of representation and understanding. We're able to collect facts and take actions that we nevertheless don't understand and can't speak clearly about." And all of this goes to the theme of that first sentence over and over. Why are Douloy and Benoussoy constitutionally unfit to even conceive of the very things that Aristoi are most dedicated to? And it's the Aristoi, it's their dedication to intrinsic truth that makes them potentially fit to govern. And it is the incomprehensibility of that to Douloy and Benoussoy that makes them unfit to govern. So what is that thing? What is the nature of that? And the problem is that, to become an Aristos is partly to have to develop one way or another some kind of language for talking about these problems. You have to have a way to talk about what is a delusion, what is a worldview, what is a character, and how does that relate to a mode of thinking. If you can't put all these pieces together, then you can't explain the human problem. And if you can't explain the human problem, if you can't say it, you can't think it, you certainly can't solve it. It becomes an unrepresentable thing. It becomes absurd. So for this reason, part of the struggle is to overcome the limitations that prevent us from speaking or thinking clearly about these core issues. And it's part of why, I'm committed to the idea that we borrow words from other languages that don't have the blind spots that English has. If we can't do that, we will never be able to overcome, we'll never be able to solve the problems that English is incapable of thinking about or talking about. What is Gnosis? What is Noesis? What is Begriff? What is Verstand? What is Vernunft? What is a doulos? What is a Benausos? What is an Aristos? All of these things have to be thinkable and sayable in order to even produce Aristoi. That is, by Aristotle's argument, in order to even be able to govern yourselves as a people, you have to know all these things, because these are the basic architecture of who it is that is trying to govern themselves and where the limits and liabilities are of their capabilities. If that's inexpressible in your language, then your language is not capable of producing governance. Now, it can produce something else that it claims is governance for the reasons we talked about before. The nature of Banausea, the nature of Douleia is that they think that they have explained everything, they think it all makes sense, and they have a misunderstanding for everything that they think is an understanding. And so they will do something they call governing, but it will inevitably end up with massive amounts of corruption. Inexplicably, who could have foreseen this? For which there was no way of understanding it in the English language, only ways of misunderstanding it. So this problem of representation and understanding, this is why I draw pictures. It's why I draw diagrams. It's why I'm teasing out language and vocabulary. I'm doing all of this stuff in order to try to address Valerie's core point here, which is if we want to engage in heuristic activities such as philosophy or governance, then we have to put in time on developing our language and our idea hoard and our word hoard with all the caveats that go with that. So Paul Valery, he's always worth reading. His essays are not ever, they're anti-Nietzschean in the sense that they are never full of brimming over with vitality and life and just, oh my God, it's so riveting. He writes calmly. And so you have to have an appetite for that particular approach, that calm text. But if you do, then when you read Valery, you're going to come across passage after passage after passage as profound as this one. This sets up the final quote from the opening of Otherwise, which again is highly relevant to the sentence. And that's Hannah Arendt, favorite quote from The Human Condition. But could it be that we, who are earthbound creatures and have begun to act as though we were dwellers of the universe, will forever be unable to understand, that is, to think and speak about the things which nevertheless we're able to do? It's what does it mean when the law of unintended consequences rules you as a person and as a people, in part because you have no language to explain what you're doing. The unintended consequences are inexpressible, and thus you can't ever get a handle on them unless you change the way that you speak and you think. So yes, thank you for that link, Stephen. I'll follow up on that after this, because I'm really into this myth of Fenris. I was really enjoying this morning the idea that Fenris had been raised by a pup, from a pup by the god Tyr. I didn't know that before today either. He was his wolf puppy. It's just that he kept growing, getting fiercer. That presented the problem. So anyway, Hannah Arendt, she's brilliant on this. And of course, the origins of totalitarianism, where she talks about the inexorable allegiance to logic that drove Nazi Germany in exactly the same way that it drove the Stalinist purges. That whole, we must do what our logic says because otherwise chaos will ensue. It's absolute stifling order or the death of everything is the proposition of every totalitarian ideology. And they offer the solution, which is let us all become little robots marching in time with our ideology, and that will solve all our problems. She's really astute. So our final comment, a final quote, is one that's not part of at the opening of Webs and otherwise. It's just one that I like, and that is obviously relevant here once you see it. And that's Heraclitus. Eyes and ears make poor witnesses for men with barbarian souls. And this is part of his core concept, that to be barbaric, according to Heraclitus, is not just to be somebody who doesn't speak Greek. He's breaking with the Greek tradition here, the Hellenic tradition, and saying, language is important, but the core issue is, what is the makeup of your character, your soul, your character? What has been imprinted upon the raw metal of your soul to make you who you are? How does it read the world, or does it misread the world? And if your character is off enough, then no amount of evidence of nature, what you see and what you hear and anything else, none of it's going to get you out of that trap. Because, as we said, an ideology has an interpretation for everything. There is some way that Douleia has to make everything seem to fit with and reinforce Douleia. And there is some way that Banausea can find to make everything that it admits to be real seem to fit within and thus reinforce Banausea. The structure of the delusions that Kierkegaard talks about earlier, it works through the eyes and ears so that the addition of more evidence fails to rupture the envelope that's keeping someone trapped within mirrors and lenses of their worldview. What Heraclitus here calls a barbarian soul, it's barbaric because you don't really have access to truth, and you don't really have access to justice if you can't see according to nature, if all you can see is according to your desires or according to your ideologies. So I can't remember, somebody said something earlier in this, I don't know if it was Donald or Stephen, said something that made me think about the way that Heraclitus, although he inherited the rulership of Ephesus, the second richest city of the ancient world, and although he inherited the oversight and running of the Eleusinian mysteries, that is both the religion and the politics of the second richest city, he gave it all up. He just said, nope. He handed it to his brother and he went off to the hills. He said, I would rather live out in the hills in nature, where I can see things for myself and hear them for myself and judge them for myself, and where I can wrestle with the demons of my character without distraction, than to wield all this power in customary ways, because the customary ways are so wrong. They're so corrupted by wealth and by popular opinion, by demagoguery, by ideology. Because even just being around that stuff, even as the most privileged person in one of the wealthiest places of the ancient world, it's still too painful. There's not enough money in the world to buy me insulation from the pain of being in relentless contact with Douloy and Banausoi. He says, and I can't at the same time shoulder the burden of struggling against my own idiocy while relentlessly being tugged on by the idiocy of others, trying to distract me away from it. He says, the agon, the boulder that I need to push up that hill, takes everything that I've got, and I don't have anything left over for all this nonsense. And I don't care how many rewards come with it. I don't care about the money or the prestige or the fame. I don't care that I'm breaking with generations of tradition in my family. There's somebody else who can do that stuff. All I care about is, this is the only thing worth having. He says, people fail to understand that wisdom stands apart from all else. Of all the other virtues, wisdom is the only one. If you had to pick only one, wisdom is the only one worth picking. because foolishness can corrupt any other virtue. So what's the good of having another virtue but being a fool? He says, wisdom is the one that you have to strive for and you have to be willing to sacrifice for. And he put his money where his mouth was by sacrificing literally everything that he had and going to do without and living in the woods. And when people said, but you walked away from the great temple of Artemis, one of the wonders of the world, a great center of spirituality, and you walked away from all the priests and all the other wise men. Why would you do that? Why would you cut yourself off from the gods? And he looked at his guest and laughed. He's sitting there at a fire that he built for himself, campfire in the night, making his food over the fire. And he gestured at the fire and in the darkness and said, here too, there are gods. So if I want to be in touch with the divine, I don't have to do it in a big fancy temple. Nature has its truth everywhere. Its authority is everywhere. You don't need to be in a special place for that. Or rather, you do, and that place is outside of the habits of the cities and away from the distractions, away from the temptations, the endless siren song to conform and to give in to your desires and your ideologies. Get away from all that. And then you only have the main struggle of an Aristos, the agon, to overcome yourself, to know thyself and overcome it. Thus, Nietzsche, man is a problem that must be overcome. When Nietzsche says that, obviously he's indirectly citing Heraclitus, who never said that in words, but whose life was a testament to the fact that he meant it. So these are the quotes that I had for today, and we'll do questions and comments, and then it looks like we have time. We might start into the second sentence today. James, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I like your story about the was that retired into nature.
Heraclitus, yeah.
Yeah, Heraclitus. So he's like like the Taoists in China. There's a long tradition of that, where they were Confucian bureaucrats, and they mostly they retired when they got to a certain age. They went off into the forest and became Taoists.
Yes.
So I want to also ask about this idea of trying to understand what rationality is. So Aristotle had certain kind of rationality, right? A certain concept of reason, which is the principle of non-contradiction.
In his logic, yes.
Right. And then, of course, later on, Hegel, certainly turned that around and said, that was wrong. That's not natural. That's you see contradictions everywhere. And that's that kind of dialectical thinking in terms of negation and contradiction is more realistic, right? So that kind of So that's one way of understanding what rationality is, right?
That's right.
I don't know if there's another one.
Yeah, so that's an excellent point, James. That Aristotle's writing late in classical Greece. He's writing after the Golden Age, although people later decide that the Golden Age includes him. The truth is, this is after the Peloponnesian War. It's all falling apart, and soon Alexander's going to come and conquer them. But so as a result, this is deep into the process that Nietzsche would later identify as the great shift among the Hellenics from a more Dionysian mode of culture, a more mythic mode of culture, to a more Apollonian culture, a more logos culture. And Aristotle is a product of that late culture. He's ultra Apollonian. It's ironic how, even though it has become such an ultra Apollonian culture, he in many ways fights that tide by insisting that logic is all well and good and important, but kata phusei is still the highest authority, that you still have to go back to nature. That's a Dionysian concept, that the existence precedes the truth. But nevertheless, you can find lots of noetic contamination in Aristotle, where he overemphasizes Noetic arguments. And what you're citing is a perfect example of that. He's describing logic and the law of non-contradiction. So he's establishing binary logic, but he's doing it in such a way that it seems to equate validity and truth. The huge distinction between validity and truth would be explored some later by Stoics, but it wouldn't really be fully understood until the Persian and Arabic philosophers began testing the Greek theories and found how many of them were logical but still false. That was the first time we really fully faced the truth that logic's validity and nature's truth are not actually the same thing. There's just too many ways to logic wrong. That are correct according to logic but false according to nature. That's a huge thing. But another definition of rationality, Heraclitus says, wisdom is to know the intelligence by which all things are steered through all things. And elsewhere he says it's the lightning bolt that steers all things. And what he's talking about between these two sayings is the concept that we live in a nature that's made up of dynamic systems full of powerful, unimaginably powerful energies that drive and create everything around us. And that there is a fake rationality, which is the rationality of Gnosis, which is concerned with how many facts have you collected and how well do you follow the rules of logic. He says, but that's only a half-wit kind of a rationality. He says the real rationality, real wisdom, has less to do with whether you follow some script of rules and more to do with however you're going about it. Are you coming to understand the nature of these dynamic systems and where everything comes from? Are you understanding the archae that make everything what they are, and how they function and how they relate to each other? He says, the human nature has no real understanding. Only the divine nature has it. And of course, to the Greeks, the divine nature is not transcendent above nature, but is an expression of nature. Their gods, their polytheistic deities are expressions of the archae in nature. So when he says this, what he's saying is that the logos of nature, phusis, it's logos that organizes and drives it, that has real understanding. And that to the extent that we harmonize our thinking with that logos, we begin to carry real understanding. But to the extent that we can learn and think and not harmonize with the logos of nature, then we don't have an understanding. We have something else that thinks it's understanding but isn't. He writes a lot about the difference between the shared intelligence of the world that we should be focusing on and the private intelligence that each person has, their own private worldview, how they think the world works. And he says, if we understand this, the relationship between the two, so that we understand that it's our duty to change our private intelligence to more and more harmonize with the shared intelligence of nature, then we grow wiser. But if we do the opposite and suppress and turn away from our shared intelligence of nature and focus instead on the private intelligence of our ideologies and desires, then to that extent, we become more and more foolish and trapped in our foolishness until finally we become sleepwalkers, walking through the world and not reacting to what's true, but only to the dreams that we're having about it. When you put all these pieces together in Heraclitus, you can see he's got a pretty sophisticated concept of the nature of rationality. And ultimately, this is what Hegel builds on. And it's why Hegel's not exaggerating when he says there isn't a single proposition of Heraclitus's that Hegel didn't incorporate into the core of Hegel's own philosophy. He's saying basically, this is the good stuff. He agrees with Heraclitus. This is what wisdom is. This is what philosophy is. And this is what I'm going to build my whole philosophy out of. Yeah. And Stephen's got good points about that in the chat. Thank you. So Phil, go ahead, and then we'll see where we stand on the clock.
Yeah, I think as much as I'm beginning to like Hegel a lot, I mean, there's still a point that I sort of am troubled by. And I think when he talks about the spirit, guys, he is ambiguous, and maybe ambiguity is right in this sense, that it's mine. He used mine and he uses Geist, right? And so finally, the logic is like situated in the mind, and somehow the mind reaches nature in some sense in its development. Okay, so he at least loosened the rope about this sort of, this sort of zeitgeist that it develops slowly. It's not something that's just totally reductive. And I thought that perhaps instead of wanting to clear it up, he might leave it that there's always an ambiguity within Geist itself. And I once again go back to that thing about the divided line. If you could see the divided line as the transcendent, not the transcendental, then in a sense, the horizon is where we're at. And you could be transcendent in the speculative, but it's only the speculative. It's not authenticated. Okay. So I think the problem is that he's still a metaphysician in the sense that he want to construct an architecture, a structure that would be comprehensive. And I think that in some sense the structure is incomplete.
Yes.
At least it's tied to mind,
Yes.
maybe not Geist, which is sort of ambiguous. And I go back to, even though I'm not a Christian, I really go back to the myth of the Garden of Eden, right? When mankind ate the apple, he's become wise, in
Right.
quotes, right? And in a sense, he knew that he will eventually become God. He doesn't need God, right? And so I'm not sure whether God threw him out of the Garden of Eden, if that's what the Bible said, or whether he was arrogant enough to say, screw this, I'm out of here.
Right.
Right?
Right.
But unfortunately, he forgot.
You're not my daddy.
Unfortunately, he forgot that there was also a tree of life.
Yes.
Right? And the tree of knowledge is incomplete without the tree of life. And so he shouldn't have given the finger to daddy.
Yes.
Do you want to put it that way? Because
Yes.
there's the other half. And the other half is necessary to complete the dialectical relationship.
Yes.
And so when you're only dealing with a half, no matter how you develop this sort of, this sort of logic of Geist, then it still becomes a structure. And that's why I really, in some sense, I kind of think that Heidegger was more correct. With reason itself, all we could do is come to the clearing and look at what the clearing is, right? And in some sense, that means that we're always somewhat incomplete. And I myself, sometimes I sound arrogant, but I'm not. I'm actually humble enough to say, I'm happy enough to push the ball forward to the horizon, right? That's why I keep talking about the way station, the halfway house. You want to put it that way?
Well, standing at the gate.
That's right. Yeah, and let history push it another bit forward.
Yeah.
In that sense, rather than saying, I've solved the problem. That's it. And maybe that's why I'm an artist rather than more deeply than a philosopher. because an artist just does stand in the gate. Either we do not have the deep enough wisdom to understand all of it, or else we're not arrogant enough to think that we could understand all of it.
Mhm.
So I kind of think that that's true, it's like, yes, there's the end is merely the beginning. There is a wood spirit, but we don't know what the hell it is, really.
Yes.
We just
Yeah.
want to get there, but we don't know what the hell it is. And I think that's in some ways irritating, but it's sort of the right way to be. And it's like, that's good enough. Let me say one more thing that was interesting. About 5 years ago, I listened to this woman who was actually quite into Heraclitus. She happened to be a Catholic, which is sort of interesting that she would be. And she talked about the myth of Moses going up to Mount Sinai. And she said, the decisive moment was not when God was the burning bush and gave him the laws, right? But it was when he came down and saw everybody, all the fools worshiping the golden calf. He got so angry that he threw the tablet down on the ground and it fractured.
Mhm.
He said that is the decisive moment. Because in the fracture, man was able to interpret into the cracks. So there was a relationship between the transcendental and the manifestation.
Yes.
All we could do is do that, and that's the relationship between the Torah and the Talmud and the Jewish tradition, right?
Right.
That's all we could do, is to make the interpretation, to make the immediate judgment in what the thing is, because that language is incomprehensible, incomplete, and all we could do is live in interpretation, and that's an important thing to have. And is that transcendental? No, but that's good enough for now.
Yes.
So we get to the next point. It's like, I think that's good, even if you believe in religion, because now it develops a relationship between God and man. Not just a top down, just follow my orders, that's it. Otherwise it's hell.
Right.
You're gonna be with Osiris. That's it. And so I kind of think that we have to be a little bit more humble, at least in regard to what wisdom is. So I think that's I think because life is always interposing upon
Quite.
us.
Thank you, Phil. Okay. Well, 10 minutes left. This may be a good time to mention, something that we've said before, which is that Kenneth Smith says all philosophy is either escapist or existentialist. To understand that now in terms of this model of the doulos and the benausos, each living inside their own escapist bubble, and that they prefer that imaginary reality, that as Heraclitean private intelligence, to the shared intelligence of acting kata phusea, according to nature. And that's why when they encounter surds, they suppress them. If it can't be reinterpreted as Dulea, if it can't be reinterpreted as Benausea, then it is a non-thing, and we'll just pretend that's not real. It's an anomaly, and we'll shove it aside. And that the Aristos instead seizes on it and goes, now this is interesting because this suggests that our system is wrong or our desires are wrong. Let's explore that problem and see if we can rupture, if we can break up the frozen sea within us a little further. That's what an existentialist wants to do. And so what Kenneth Smith is arguing is that all Aristoi, all true Aristoi are existentialists. They want to talk about how it really is and not just flee into some tidy system that they've put together. You look at Hegel and he's responding to Kant. Kant is a pure noetic philosopher. He's trying to purge his philosophy of everything that isn't noesis. And Hegel's trying to one-up Kant by fixing him, by reintroducing nature and growth and development into his model of the mind. But he still wants to make a system, right? So Hegel is he's kind of a salamander. He's standing between the world of the frogs and the world of the reptiles, in that on the one hand, he wants to philosophize kata fusei, but on the other hand, he still really wants to put together a nice, tidy noetic system that would impress Kant. He doesn't just want to refute Kant, he wants to impress Kant, sort of posthumously. And, as Nietzsche would later critique him, Hegel also wants to impress his universities and other academicians and thrive in his university career. And Nietzsche says that is a conflict of interest. There are certain hands that for which Hegel is unwilling to be a Fenris, and he's not going to bite those hands, even though they desperately need to be bitten. It says some boats should be rocked, but when your income depends upon you not rocking the boat, it will cause you to corrupt and your own philosophy in order to be pleasing to those who control your paycheck and your lunch. And of course, our later critiques are that Nietzsche's right about Hegel, and you can see more of that when you see the way that Hegel also doesn't want to question the orthodoxy of his religion. He also doesn't want to question the orthodoxy of Europe as the most advanced country in the world. His concept of history leading to Europe is compatible with the dominant culture around him, where they all believe that they're better than everybody else and they need to rule the world and conquer it and use its resources wisely. All of this stuff, these are things that Hegel's not willing to question, even though Hegel's own philosophy says he should be questioning these things. Kata fusei, he should be asking himself, is Europe really the best? Is my university really unerring? Is my theology truly without flaws? Am I really competent to create a noetic system, or should I humble myself and just instead create the parts that I've worked out and admit that the rest of it I don't have worked out, because I'm immortal, I'm finite, I'm only going to be around for so long, I'm only going to understand so much, the cosmos is infinite, and my job, as you said, Phil, is just to move the ball down the field, not to get to the finish line, because it's impossible for a finite understanding to ever reach the finish line of understanding the infinite. So it's always illustrative to look at Hegel in terms of what he was willing to question and what he wasn't, what he conformed to and what he broke ranks with. And you see the same thing with the Greeks. What did they understand and break free from, and what could they not question in themselves and therefore were subject to and trapped by? It's always interesting. We learn as much from both sides, what they saw and what they couldn't let themselves see. And that teaches us about ourselves, right? It teaches us that we too are going to be caught on the horns of that same dilemma. There are things that we're going to be willing to break with the crowd and ask questions, even hard questions. But there are going to be other places where the cost is too high. We're raised in a modernist culture and a modernist civilization that puts many things that we need to survive at stake. And so there are certain things, boats we don't want to rock, and there are certain hands we don't want to bite, because if we do, the cost is just too high. We don't want to end up homeless or in a mental institution. And we know that if you push hard enough, or prison, we know if you push hard enough, one of those three things is waiting for you. So we're willing to push so far and no further. Nietzsche's critique of the weaknesses of Kant applies to us quite well as well. So it's one of the interesting things about Kenneth Smith, as we're wrapping up today, is that he followed Heraclitus's example. Right? He had a promising career at the universities, but by insisting on teaching what people needed to know instead of what the university wanted them to teach. He was constantly at struggle with the authorities of the two universities that he taught at. And eventually he decided that if he was going to be true to philosophy, true to wisdom, he would have to set aside his career and just become an independent scholar, because that way they wouldn't have a leash on him. They wouldn't be able to, they wouldn't have the leverage over him. They wouldn't have anything that could threaten to take away from him. And yeah, it would make things more difficult, but it would also make other things easier. And the things that made easier were the hard things that an Aristos is supposed to be doing. Questioning yourself, questioning your assumptions, questioning power. So this has been our little interlude between sentences 1 and 2. Sentence 2 is a much longer sentence than sentence 1, but it will take us less time to go through. Because with sentence 1, we've got the principle of the thing worked out. We've done it now once. We see how it works. And we've also introduced many of the core ideas that he's going to be working with in sentence 2. So I don't know if it's going to be 1 week or 2 weeks, but it'll be shorter to get through. And once we're done with this, we'll launch into section C. So here endeth my rant for today, my little interregnum for you guys, and I hope it was satisfactory.
Hey, thanks. This was good,
Yay!
but I'm not sure if I believe your promise of it being shorter next time.
I'm not sure I do either, but we'll give it a shot. We'll see how it goes. So, thanks everyone.
Well, thank you, Rick, as always. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.